Today, you're going to hear an incredible story. A story about a pope, but not the one you think you know. It begins not in the grand halls of the Vatican, but in a dark alley of Rome, one cold night in 1998. This is the story of how a homeless man saved a future pope, and how, 27 years later, that pope would return the favor in a way no one could have imagined. Subscribe to my channel, hit that like button, and leave a comment. For every new subscriber, I will donate $1 to a charity helping the homeless. Rome, November 2nd, 1998. The rain had started just after sunset, light at first, then steadily heavier, tapping rhythmically against the cobblestones like a warning. A young man in a long black cassock walked briskly down a narrow side street near Trastevere. His name was Roberto Mancini, 38 years old, recently promoted to cardinal. He held a leather briefcase tight to his chest, his breath visible in the cold air. He should have taken the car, but he had told his driver he wanted to walk. To think, to be alone with his thoughts after the tense meeting at the Apostolic Palace. The documents in his case were confidential, letters from a South American bishop accusing a high-ranking Vatican official of abuse and embezzlement. Roberto had promised to deliver them personally. He turned left, taking a shortcut through an alley he knew well. That's when he heard the footsteps. At first, just one pair, then two, then three. He didn't turn around, he quickened his pace. The footsteps did too. Then came the voice, rough, Roman accent, low and threatening. "Give us the bag, priest." Roberto stopped, his grip tightened on the briefcase. "Please," he said. "I have nothing of value." One of the men laughed. Another stepped forward, into the dim light of the alley lamp. His face was pale, scarred, and cruel. A flick of his hand revealed a short knife. "We'll decide that, holy man." Roberto turned to run, but one of them grabbed his shoulder and shoved him hard against the wall. The breath was knocked out of him. He tried to call for help, but a second man punched him in the stomach. He fell to his knees, clutching the briefcase like a lifeline, and then chaos. A shadow moved fast through the alley, low and silent like a beast. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, burst out from behind a dumpster and tackled the nearest attacker to the ground. The sound of fists against bone echoed through the narrow street. The scarred man turned to fight, but was met with a single punch that knocked him unconscious. The third attacker ran. The man who saved Roberto stood still for a moment, breathing heavily. His coat was torn, his face weathered and unshaven. He looked down at Roberto, who was still on the ground, clutching his ribs. "Are you all right?" the man asked. Roberto nodded, stunned. Yes, I think so." Who are you?" The man looked away, then said quietly, "No one important." He turned to leave. "Wait, please," said Roberto, struggling to his feet. "You saved my life. At least let me thank you." The man paused only briefly, then gave the faintest smile. "Stay out of dark alleys, father." And with that, he disappeared into the shadows. By the time the police arrived, the attackers were unconscious or gone. But the man who had saved Roberto, the nameless homeless man, had vanished as if he'd never existed. Roberto searched for him for days, weeks. He went to shelters, talked to priests and street workers. No one knew the man, no one had seen him, but Roberto never forgot that face, or the feeling that the man carried a story, far darker and deeper than anyone could guess, and one day, that story would return. Vatican City, March 2025. The silence of the Apostolic Palace was never truly silent. At night, it breathed, creaked, hummed, with the low pulse of ancient stone and sacred tradition. But on this particular evening, in the private quarters of Pope Leo XIV, the silence was heavier than usual. He stood by the tall window, looking out at St. Peter's Square. The floodlights painted everything in silver and shadow. His white cassock shimmered faintly, under the moonlight. He still couldn't sleep. It had been 2 weeks since his election. 2 weeks of endless meetings, ritual obligations, and global headlines about the American Pope, who promised transparency, reform, and compassion. And yet, in the quiet, his mind kept returning to the past, to a rainy alley in Rome, to the man who had saved him. He'd never found him. The Vatican had its own archives, of course, sealed, cold, and guarded by protocols older than most governments. Roberto, now Pope Leo, had requested old security tapes, hoping, by some miracle, they might contain a clue. Nothing, until tonight. He was reviewing footage from that very afternoon, almost absent-mindedly, sipping chamomile tea, watching the Vatican's outer courtyard. There were pilgrims, tourists, priests, a few nuns. A girl dropped her scarf. An old man picked it up. A stray dog wandered too close to the Swiss guard. Then, at the edge of the screen, a figure, robed in layers of worn fabric, hat pulled low, a beard graying and unkempt. He moved slowly, cautiously, as if trying not to be seen. But the Pope saw him, and froze. The face was older, thinner, battered by time, but the eyes were the same, dark, watchful, haunted. It was him. He didn't blink. He rewound. He didn't blink. He rewound. The footage paused, zoomed in. The footage was grainy, but the shape of the jaw, the scar near the left temple, unmistakable. It was the man from the alley. After 27 years, the Pope pressed a button on the console. "Sister Amelia," he said into the calm. "Yes, Your Holiness, I need security footage from every external camera on the perimeter. Starting 3 hours ago, focus on the northern gate and the market entrance, and send Captain LaRusso to me. Immediately." "Yes, Your Holiness." Within minutes, his private chamber became a situation room. Monitors flickered, guards entered, and stood silently. The Pope gave no explanation, only a still image, captured from the tape. "Find this man. But do not alert the press, and do not frighten him. If he runs, we lose everything." Captain LaRusso, a tall man with military precision and unusually kind eyes, took one long look at the photo. "Who is he?" "Holy Father, a ghost," said the Pope, "one I owe my life to." The man in rags moved through the crowd, unnoticed. He had learned long ago how to disappear in plain sight. He hadn't meant to come near the Vatican, but something had drawn him, a pull he couldn't explain. He stopped by a fountain, hands shaking. In his coat beneath the lining was a folded letter, faded and yellowed with time. The letter was addressed to one man, Cardinal Roberto Mancini. But that man, as he would soon learn, no longer existed, and the man who wore white now had the power to change the world. They found him just before dawn, hunched beneath an old stone archway near the fish market, half asleep, half frozen, with a single blanket over his shoulders and a plastic bag full of torn books and crusts of bread. When the Vatican guards approached, he didn't flinch. He simply looked up, calm, tired, as if he had been waiting for them all night. "Are you going to arrest me?" he asked. "No, sir," said Captain LaRusso. "The Holy Father wants to speak with you. Alone." The man's face twitched, a flicker of emotion, hard to name. Suspicion? Fear? Hope? He followed without a word. They brought him through a side gate, unseen by the tourists, through a tunnel used mostly by staff. He walked slowly, limping slightly. His eyes darted from the marble columns to the ancient frescoes. He hadn't been inside these walls in over 3 decades. When they reached the private garden behind the Apostolic Palace, the guard stopped. "He's waiting for you there." The man stepped through the gate and froze. On a simple bench, beneath a cypress tree, sat the Pope, alone. No guards, no cardinals, no gold or grandeur, just a man in white, with kind eyes and lines on his face from a life of burdens. "You remember me?" said the Pope. The man gave a quiet nod. "Of course I do. I never forgot." The Pope gestured to the bench beside him. "Sit, please." They sat in silence for a long time. The birds had just started to sing. The Vatican dome loomed behind them like a silent witness. "You saved my life," said the Pope softly. "And then you vanished. Why?" The man rubbed his hands together, as if trying to warm the truth out of his bones. "Because if they saw me, they'd kill me too." The Pope turned to him slowly. "Who, exactly?" The man looked down. "Your church." He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded letter. Yellow, frayed, stained by time. "I was a sacristan in 1989. Small parish near Naples. I saw something. Something I wasn't supposed to see." He handed the letter to the Pope. Inside were notes, names, dates, a photograph of 3 boys, and a single sentence: "They were taken, and we covered it up." The Pope's fingers tightened around the page. "I gave this to a bishop. I thought he'd help. A week later, I was dismissed. My house was burned down. My name erased from every record. So I ran. I've been running ever since." He looked at the Pope now. Not with fear, but defiance. "I didn't come here to ask forgiveness. I came to see if you were the man I thought you were. If the boy from that alley still had fire in his chest." The Pope didn't speak. Tears filled his eyes. He reached over, gently placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "I remember that fire," he said. "And I promise you this time, it will burn through every wall of silence." The man lowered his head, his voice cracking. "I kept it all these years, hoping someone would listen, someone who wouldn't call it sin to tell the truth." Pope stood. "Then we begin now. Together. In the coming weeks." The Vatican was shaken. Secret tribunals opened. Files unsealed. Whispers turned to headlines. Some called the Pope a traitor. Others called him a savior. But through it all, one thing remained unchanged. Every morning the man who once slept beneath archways now sat beside the Pope, as his advisor. And the world watched as 2 men, one in robes, one in rags, rewrote the future of the Church. By April, the Vatican was under siege. Not from outside, but from within. High-ranking officials, some with decades of power behind them, began resisting the Pope's reforms. Files vanished overnight. Witnesses suddenly recanted. Anonymous letters warned the Holy Father to stop digging up the dead. One cardinal even said it to his face during a synod. "You are cracking the very foundation of the Church, Your Holiness." To which the Pope simply replied, "Then let it crack." But he was not naive. He knew the storm was coming. And he wasn't wrong. One rainy night, the man who once lived nameless on the streets, whose real name was Matteo Leone, failed to arrive at the garden. The Pope waited. 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. He called for LaRusso. "Check every gate, every hallway, every camera, now." Within 30 minutes, they had their answer. Footage showed Matteo walking toward the small chapel near the archives, then disappearing. A few frames later, a black van left through the east gate. Unauthorized guard was missing. So was one of the cardinals. The Pope's hands trembled as he watched the screen. They took him. Captain LaRusso stared at him. "What do you want to do, Holy Father?" "Everything," the Pope said. "I want everything." Within 24 hours, every cardinal was summoned, every corridor locked, Lerusso's men searched every room, but there was no sign of Matteo. Only a message left in the chapel. Only a message left in the chapel. One line, scratched into the altar with a knife. You cannot cleanse what was born in blood. The Pope held the message in his hands like a dead bird. This wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration. The days that followed were the darkest of his papacy. Reporters sensed something. Cameras hovered outside the Vatican gates. Rumors spread that someone had disappeared, that the Pope had gone silent. But no one knew the full truth. Except for him. Every night, he sat alone in Matteo's small room. It had been cleaned, but he refused to move anything. He kept the man's coat on the chair, the old photo of the three boys on the desk, and the letter, now locked in a fireproof case in his chamber. He couldn't stop hearing Matteo's voice. If they saw me, they'd kill me too. The guilt nearly broke him, but then, 5 days after the disappearance, a miracle, or maybe a message. Call came to the Vatican's emergency line, from a payphone near Naples. A man's voice, raspy and weak. He's alive, the Pope whispered. Matteo had been held in an abandoned monastery, starved, interrogated, left to die, but someone, a young novice, new to the order, had heard his cries and let him go. By dawn, Lorusso's team had him back inside Vatican walls, bruised, but alive. The Pope didn't speak when they embraced. He simply held him, like a brother pulled from the grave. You were right, said Matteo, barely able to stand. They'll never stop. Then neither will I, said the Pope. What followed became known in whispered Vatican halls as Il Giudizio Bianco, the White Judgment, a secret tribunal, held in the catacombs. No media, no lawyers, just the Pope, a panel of 4 trusted bishops, and the evidence Matteo had carried for 27 years. 15 names were read aloud, 7 removed from office, 2 arrested by Italian authorities, and 1, a cardinal long protected by layers of silence, took his own life before the trial could begin. The Vatican shook. Some feared collapse. Others saw light for the first time in years. But the Pope did not celebrate. Instead, he stood in the courtyard, before cameras and the world, and said, "We must not protect stone, while children suffer in the shadows of it." That evening, he met Matteo again in the garden. "You're not safe here," the Pope said. Matteo smiled faintly. "You think I ever was?" The Pope took a breath. "If something happens to me, promise me, you'll keep speaking." Matteo's face hardened. "No," he said. "If something happens to me, you keep fighting." They both smiled, and for the first time in years, Matteo cried. 2 months later, the reforms had begun. Quietly, but undeniably. Several dioceses reopened long-sealed investigations. Victims were invited to speak, not behind closed doors, but in chapels, in front of those who once silenced them. The Pope traveled more than ever before, not to grand cathedrals, but to orphanages, hospitals, burned churches, forgotten towns. He never wore gold, never sat on thrones. He had become, in the eyes of the world, the people's Pope. And by his side, always in the background, always unmentioned, walked Matteo, still in plain clothes, still anonymous. Until one morning, in November, Matteo collapsed on the steps of the library. The doctors said it was his heart. Years of exposure, starvation, stress, the old wounds from the past, had caught up. He had only days left. The Pope visited him in the small Vatican infirmary. No cameras, no cardinals, just the two of them. Matteo looked small in the bed, smaller than ever. But his eyes, The same eyes that stared into Roberto's all those years ago in the alley still burned. They talked for hours. About Naples. About the alley. About God. Do you still believe? The Pope asked. In him. Yes. Matteo whispered. In the men who wear his robes. No. Except you. The Pope lowered his head. I don't deserve your trust. Matteo laughed. It was weak, but honest. You didn't earn it. You kept it. That's harder. There was silence. And then Matteo coughed. Hard. Blood touched his lips. The Pope gripped his hand. Matteo. I don't want to die in this bed. Matteo whispered. I want to see the sky one last time. The dome. The square. The next morning, at sunrise, the Pope himself wheeled Matteo outside. No one stopped him. No one dared. They sat at the edge of St. Peter's Square, where pigeons circled, and the early pilgrims whispered prayers. Matteo looked up at the basilica, the same place where once 27 years ago, he had watched from the shadows. It's beautiful, he said. So are you. The Pope replied. Matteo smiled, then closed his eyes, and never opened them again. 3 days later, the Pope gave the eulogy himself. He didn't call Matteo a prophet or a saint. He simply said, this man told the truth when it was dangerous, and loved the Church, even when it hated him. We owe him not silence, but action. He was buried beneath the Vatican garden, in a simple grave, no title, no marble, just one line on the stone. Matteo Leone. He saw, he spoke, he stayed.